Hi, it's Marianne Smith. This presentation will be on the influences on restricted immigration political opinion. I'll be testing the significance of TV news consumption versus some other already established indicators of restrictive immigration and political opinion. So to briefly introduce the topic, I included a quote: "Both public opinion about immigration and immigration policy itself appear to be driven more by stereotype than by empirical fact." And so I wanted to explore, how are these stereotypes perpetuated and maintained? Leo Chavez, he writes a lot about media and immigration, has this phrase that they're taken for granted truths that we are exposed to and repeat, and thus kind of initiate this cycle of these stereotypes regarding what we consider, just common sense about immigration. So according to him and many others I'll mention, media is the biggest tool to begin and maintain the stereotypes about immigration. Some factors for formation of restrictive immigration political opinion. In a similar strain as the taken for granted truths, the common sense is that ethnocentrism and group cues, it's communicated through the news media, which elevates levels of anxiety within the in-group against the out-group, however that's defined. And that this anxiety can actually impact voting behavior, political action. It can affect the way you exercise your political opinion, not just how you feel about a certain group. Minority threat theory is also a common response, which is that, the theory that with increased perception of, with the perception of increased population of minority groups, that this increases an anxiety or a feeling of threat within the majority group. So that could be, in discussion of immigration, could be just American citizens in general. Most often what we see is that it is referring to white Americans against minority ethnic immigrant groups. Also, immigrants are disproportionately criminalized in the media. So this further elicits the threat perception. It's not just something that you may or may not experience in the real world, but it's you're receiving that message of, the increase in population could be like they're physically in a certain neighborhood or they're in a certain job market. They're coming over in waves. All these things we see often in media, particularly cable news. And so this can further produce those true feelings of anxiety, despite never having met or an immigrant or seen anything happen with your own eyes. It's the media is creating this real, actual feeling within you, which can then, of course, lead, as the previous phase I've mentioned, to forming political opinions that are for harsher immigration policy, and be more anti-immigrant sentiment in general. And then various studies, I just included one here, it's well established that religious conservatism and a lower income level are also associated with possessing more restrictive political opinions regarding immigration. So my research question, so out of the following established predictors for supportive restrictive immigration policy, which most strongly predicts support for more restrictive immigration policy? So even though there are multiple studies that do talk about each of these variables, I wanted to know which one could we find out which one might be stronger out of economic class, evangelical affiliation, and then solely or primarily consuming TV news to learn about current events, as opposed to reading journal articles or talking to people in the community, whatever. And evangelical, I don't define it, but the variable I used, I'll get into in a moment, is if you've had a reborn again experience, which is it's in line with most evangelical Protestant theology, that's a key tenet to being a Christian, is to be born again. And so I wanted to measure this specifically because typically evangelicals are the Protestant Christian group that tend to be the more conservative religious groups. And so many of the other variables that talk about religion in the GSS don't get at the heart of it. Like what I wanted to test, was just the evangelical component, not just if you say you're Christian, not Christian, or religious, not religious. Doesn't matter if you go to church or not go to church. A lot of those variables we're looking at behaviors, but it's more about the group identity that you associate with. And so that key phrase about being born again is really prominent and doesn't really talk about, even though it's referring to theology, it's not like you're not having to engage in theological discussion. It's a phrase kind of ingrained in everyday conversation and in songs at church and sermons. So that kind of within the survey best captured that identity. And so then my hypothesis is that TV news consumption as primary source of news information and holding restrictive immigration policy political opinion will be statistically significant and will have a stronger relationship than the other variables measured using Kramer's V. So like I said, I used a 2012 General Social Survey. It's from a large survey, it's representative, and they measure attitudinal trends. And so to run the test, I wanted to do multivariate regression, but all of the variables that I chose are nominal. So instead, I ran chi-square analysis and then used Kramer's V to test for the strength of the relationship. And so I have 4 independent variables: class, which the label is just subjective class identification. It went by, well, we'll go over the variables, but it's what you identify as. This is not measuring your actual income. Religious affiliation, your religious preference, evangelical, which I mentioned I measured as whether or not you say you've had a born again experience. News, so where you get your news from, if it's just primarily from TV, is it from books, is it from journal articles, and then I'm seeing those independent variables effect on a dependent variable, which is an individual's political opinion on immigration-related issues, which is the variable name is let in. So what they tested, well, the question was the number of immigrants let into America nowadays should be. And then just a brief breakdown of so most people did say, and I recoded the variables here, but to make it simplify it, but most respondents were not in favor of increasing the number of immigrants. Out of the respondents, looks like most people were working class and middle class. And for primary news source, if you look at TV, there's 1,000 respondents. So although most said inapplicable, I guess I don't watch news or learn about the news, the highest number of people rely on TV to learn about news events. And the religious preference, so I thought it was interesting that most people identified as Protestant as opposed to identifying as, as Christian. If they were going to identify as a Christian, that they would choose Protestant instead. And I think it was a distinction of that the Catholic was an option. Evangelical, Baptist, and other things were options. This is a more broad overview, and so to contrast, that's where I included the born again variable. Most respondents said no, but very few, did not have a response. Most people are familiar with that language and know whether like yes or no. Okay, so first chi-square test, the cross-tabulation, show that out of people who believe that number of immigrants to the U.S. should not be increased, 17.1% primarily get their news from TV. A close second is getting their news from radio and internet. If I were going to continue with this study, if the survey had those more specific questions, I think those are closely related because they revolve around, well, the internet can be lots of things, but could include revolving around a personality, a commentary on the news events, popular radio hosts, as well as the TV news. So I think those would be, similarly lumped in a like passive consumption of media versus participation, gathering the facts, researching. You're just a passive like recipient of it. I think that's interesting. And then only 6.8 get it from print. 1.5, this included friends, family, and government agencies, things like that. So it shows that there is significant, but it's a weak relationship. It's under 1, and 1 is one is a weak relationship. Next, I looked at class and political opinion on immigrants. This was a little more, it still, as you see here, showed it was a significant, although it was weak relationship, but, let me go back, my bad. You can see my you can look at my PowerPoint later, but, it did show that among the bigger discrepancy was between working class and middle class, and then upper class was the only group that it was the lowest percentage of respondents who did not support an increase, and had the highest percentage of respondents who were in support of an increase. So that to me showed, although the numbers in general reflect that most people just were not in favor of increasing the number of immigrants, that upper class respondents were distinct in their in the percentages of people who responded saying that they were not in favor of, or that they were in favor of increasing the number of immigrants. And then the third chi-square, I did not run this test for religious affiliation, just for the purposes of the presentation. I stuck to the more narrower category of evangelical identity and opinion. And so I thought it was interesting, while on the one hand, 43% of those who believe that immigrants should not be increased had a born-again experience, 57% didn't. At the same time, almost the same numbers, 43% of those respondents who thought, we should increase the number of immigrants to the U.S. said they had a born-again experience, and almost 57% didn't. So I wouldn't be surprised that it was not significant, and it also had like the weakest relationship. So conclusions, this found that getting most of your information about news events from TV does have a significant impact on immigration-related political opinion, and that these two variables have a slightly stronger relationship than the other variables, although it is still a weak relationship. I would seek to improve the measure of evangelicalism. Perhaps there was a better way to manipulate the variables to get at that component, but it wasn't. It seems like the survey questions were a little more broad and generic. That could be something to add to the survey. And then including a measure of the type of TV news watched. I I completely realize that even that category is very broad and doesn't get at what I really wanted to know was cable news viewership. But the literature included in the literature review, their focus is actually not on cable news consumption, but on like your local TV news and how that, immigrant groups, minority groups are much more highly shown to be criminals, which impacts people's opinions and political action and feelings of threat, all of those things. So it's still completely valid. I was just more curious about cable news consumption, so I'd like to add that or find that variable to run a future study. And here are my references.